Hi, I've gone through the 2024 party manifesto so you don't have to, and I've given each of them a score and a ranking on their humanity and their workability as regards to their policies on immigration and asylum, so check it out. First, we have the Tories, and they are sticking to what they know, what we all know, the same thing again. So there's nothing new here. There's just a series of increasingly desperate dog whistles. They're sticking to their Rwanda plan that has failed and caused chaos and misery. They're sticking to keeping asylum seekers in limbo, in inadequate accommodation around the country with no solution because they won't offer them refugee status. They're sticking to a policy that won't stop the boats but will continue to cause deaths in the channel. It's a really, truly hostile and horrific and failed policy towards asylum seekers. They also promised to cut immigration year on year, which is a ridiculous promise that makes absolutely no sense because it doesn't take into account the needs of the country. We have huge skill shortages in this country. We need care workers. We need foreign students who fund our higher education system. We need people to work in construction, to work in the NHS, to work in all sorts of different areas like farming, food production. We need immigration, and just arbitrarily saying we'll bring it down actually could do a lot of harm, and it doesn't respond to reality. So this is totally unworkable. This is actually just embarrassing. I'm going to give it a 1 on humanity and a 2 on workability out of 10. That's really rubbish. Next, we come to the Lib Dems. Now, this is the first actually really good manifesto on immigration. The Lib Dems promised to end the hostile environment, which is a policy introduced by the Conservatives that aims to try to achieve lower migrant numbers by cutting the rights of migrants themselves, cutting their rights to rent, to work, to be paid adequately. And it hasn't worked. Quite obviously, it hasn't worked. It doesn't make people disappear. Cutting migrants' rights doesn't reduce the need for migrants' labour. So ending that would be a really positive thing the Lib Dems would campaign for. They also want to start by looking at improving pay and conditions in areas like the care sector, and improving that pay overall, and then that having better outcomes for our workforce, whether they're from a local background or from a migrant background, which just is sensible. It just makes sense. And they would also scrap the Rwanda plan and focus on a better functioning asylum system, and asylum seekers would have the right to work under the asylum system if their claim was dragging on and on. And they would focus on cooperation with the EU for better management of the border, which, while it's difficult, would be the only viable long-term strategy to actually approach the small boats issue. So I'm going to give the Lib Dems an 8 on humanity. It's really positive, and a 9 on workability. This would really work. So we come to Labour, and this is a really disappointing manifesto, mainly because it just has no detail in it whatsoever. It's kind of all vibes, and the vibes are overall not great. They talk about reforming systems like the points-based system for immigration and the work visa system, and that's really good. Those systems do need reform, but how so? They do talk about protecting workers' rights, and I think that would be really valuable. But again, we're lacking detail in making sure that there are protections for migrant workers as well, so that everybody has a fair and level playing field when they're going into the job market, to protect them from exploitation. Has that basic hostility baked in, because they promise that they will just reduce immigration numbers. That's a completely arbitrary promise. It doesn't respond to any of the needs that we have in our society for care workers, for doctors, for farmers, for all sorts of different skills and needs we have in our society, for people to have the right to live with their families. These are all things that we need, and that we can't necessarily predict just on a downward trajectory at all times in terms of the numbers. So if you're leading with that, you're leading us in the wrong direction. On asylum, they can't police their way out of the small boats crisis. We already have joint police forces. Another one won't make all the difference. They do say the bare minimum. They'd scrap the Rwanda plan. That's brilliant. They would focus on better asylum decision making and a better and faster and more efficient asylum process. That's good. But the devil will be in the detail. What kind of deal will they make with the EU to actually manage that border? Over the long term, we really don't know what Labour would do. So I can't give them more than a 3 on humanity because of that hostility that's baked in, and I guess a 3 on workability because there's a couple of decent ideas there, but we just don't know how they're going to implement anything in practice. SNP manifesto is refreshing because it takes a realistic look at the demographic needs that Scotland has. So it doesn't put an arbitrary obsession with reducing the numbers of immigration above the needs of the country, and that is smart. They talk about valuing the people who come to work and study and live in Scotland. They talk about reversing the hostility that faces migrants and refugees, and that is all just going to make such a difference. In practical terms, they talk about turning around counterproductive policies that only exist for hostility but that actually end up costing the taxpayer more. Things like the no recourse to public funds condition, that's applied on almost all visas. Anybody who comes to the UK, whether a migrant or a refugee, they don't have access to public funds, and what that means is that people are driven into poverty, into destitution. They end up relying on emergency services, on emergency support, and that ends up costing the taxpayer more. So it causes suffering, it doesn't gain anything for society. The SNP would turn that around, and I think that's great. Obviously they'd scrap Rwanda. This is overall a good manifesto. I would give it an 8 for humanity and an 8 for workability. This would be good news for Scotland. The Greens have a really great manifesto when it comes to immigration. So they talk about ending the hostile environment, which is a counterproductive and brutal set of policies that's aimed to make the life of migrants really, really difficult, but in fact has had really bad impacts on our society as a whole. It's really expensive. It entrenches a lot of brutality, a lot of racism and discrimination in our society, and it caused the Windrush scandal. The Greens also talk about ending immigration detention when it doesn't serve the safety of our communities. That would make a huge amount of sense. It would change so many lives, because detention is a really brutal thing, and it's also incredibly expensive and difficult to administrate. So it would save money for our communities, put that money back into systems that work better for all of us. That is a brilliant thing. They talk about safe routes to access the asylum system, and of course they would scrap the stupid Rwanda plan. The most ambitious thing they talk about doing is fully restructuring the Home Office. And I think that would be really ambitious, really difficult thing to do. But then again, anyone who's interacted with the Home Office can tell you it's a really malfunctioning organization. And I think that there's an embedded culture of hostility there. So there is a very strong argument. I'm going to give the Greens a 9 on humanity. This is a real manifesto for change, and an 8 on workability. Plaid Cymru has a fantastic manifesto for refugees and for migrants. They give a strong positive message of welcome in Wales, and reject the hostility of the Conservative Party. They say they'd scrap the Rwanda bill, focus on a better functioning asylum system, and recommit to our international legal obligations, both under the Refugee Convention and the European Court of Human Rights, which would protect the rights of migrants and refugees, of course, but also reaffirms a commitment, a strong stance to protecting all of our rights here in Britain, because we all depend on those legal institutions. It names the conflicts that people are displaced from around the world and says that those people are deserving of sanctuary, which is absolutely correct. It even talks specifically about introducing a family reunification scheme for British Gazan families, opposing the visa fee rises that we've seen under this government, protecting our university and higher education sector and the students who come here. They talk about repealing the hostile environment and valuing the care workers who come here. I think this is overall very positive. There's a bit of lack of detail on the non-asylum immigration system, so for that I'm going to give them an 8 on workability and a 9 on humanity. This is a big, beautiful vision for a welcoming Wales. I hate to take this seriously. The only way in which I really do take this manifesto seriously is in terms of the serious threat that it represents to our democracy, our economy, our well-being as a country, and our rights as Brits, as well as the rights of migrants. Because the hatred of migrants and the demonization of migrants that runs through this entire manifesto is used as a justification for their plans for the UK to follow Putin's Russia out of the European Court of Human Rights. That means British people giving up our rights just for the purpose of trying to signal ever more hostility towards migrants. And then obviously that wouldn't work. Reform's net zero migration policy would spell a death sentence for so many of our public services that rely on the skills brought in by migrants. They talk about separating people into, essential and non-essential groups of people, which is sick in the first place. But none of those people, according to Reform, deserve the rights to a family life or to the security of being able to settle in this country or to an equal and fair playing field in the workplace. I mean, this is just a manifesto for discrimination and racism. They do say they'd scrap Rwanda, but they also say they'd turn around boats in the Channel and push them back to France, which would be illegal without France's consent and couldn't be done. But also, really seriously, would result in many, many more drownings and deaths at our border. So it's absolutely unworkable. It's absolutely inhumane. It shouldn't be taken seriously, except for the threat that it is. I give it a 0 on humanity, a 0 on workability. This is a nonsense manifesto.